So before we get started, I wanted to say a couple of things. Number one is we're going to travel back in history to the year 1950. This is when the American Political Science Association put out a paper saying, "Crisis in democracy. Our political parties are too similar. And because they're too similar, there's not ideological diversity, and we cannot make informed decisions, and it's a real problem." That was 1950. Flash forward to 2019, 70 years later, there was a poll done by that same organization that said, how many of you think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing side just died? 20% said yes. How did we go from being dangerously similar to fatally divided? Well, the answer to that question is, of course, very complicated, but one of the things we can for sure point to is our political parties. They are calcified, they are far away from each other, and are becoming increasingly homogenous. To the credit of some political reformers, we're going to try to do something about that. We can point to one, the primary host of today's event, the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, Arnold Schwarzenegger, great reformer, trying to break the doom loop of party politics. Very much in the vein of Arnold Schwarzenegger, folks. We're so excited. One of the great political reformers in America today, Andrew Yang, looking to break that doom loop of our political system so that we can have what my organization and the staff who's all here, we represent the Center for the Political Future. We want a political future, and some of us are very worried that we won't have one if our trend lines continue on this way. So we're going to do a little fighting back today, a little exposure for what's broken in our system, and hopefully end with a little bit of hope about what you all, we all can do as allies to break this doom loop of our two-party political system and make sure there's a political future for all. So that said, Christian Grose, it's your show. Thank you all very much.
Good. Thanks, Cami. I'm just going to quickly introduce our speaker. Also, for those of you who've had class with me in here, this is well better attended than usual for among the students, so it's great to see everybody. My name is Christian Grose. I'm the academic director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. I'm also a professor of political science and public policy here at USC. I'm really excited to have a chance to introduce Andrew Yang. He's an energetic person who's done a lot of innovative work. What I like about you in particular is that you actually think about policy and evaluation. Was an early proponent of the UBI, which involved evaluating via random interventions if it worked or not. And so that sort of early work, I think, is something that was inspiring. But it's also doing a lot of really interesting things now with the Forward Party. He's going to talk about that today. And then Andrew Yang was a 2020 presidential candidate, as you know. I'd be curious to hear about what it was like on the debate stage and on the campaign trail, and a 2021 candidate for mayor of New York. He was named by President Obama as a presidential ambassador of global entrepreneurship. He's the founder of Humanity Forward, Venture for America, and the Forward Party. Yang's New York Times bestselling book, The War on Normal People, helped introduce the idea of universal basic income into the political mainstream. Yang is a graduate of Brown University, where he graduated with degrees in economics and political science. It's a great combination of majors. And Columbia Law School, where he was editor of the Law Review, and he lives with his family in New York. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Christian. Hello, Trojans. How are you? It's so great to be here. Wow, they should have gotten a bigger room. But thank you to the standers. It's really awesome to see so many of you here who want to actually maybe build a future we can be excited about. So how many of you are concerned with the prospects of American democracy? Let's get a show of hands on that. Yeah, you're right to be concerned. I feel bad for young people today. I really do, because you must be growing up being like, has it always been like this? It has not always been like this. It's nastier than it certainly was when I was in your shoes. So I'm the son of immigrants myself. How many of you share that distinction, son of immigrants? A lot of you in this room. So if you grew up in a family anything like my family, you might not have heard that much about U.S. politics growing up. Certainly the messages I got from my parents were not, you're going to be, like a presidential candidate someday. It was more like, you're terrible, clean your room, try not to be a burden on society, get good grades, get a good job, try and make a place for yourself in this country. I actually never talked to my parents about American politics. I went back back just last year and asked my mom, was like, hey, like, did you guys join a party? Did you vote? And she was like, we were just too busy trying to keep our heads up as immigrants to this country. So I was not someone who imagined I would get into politics. For me, the big left turn in my career happened when I started a nonprofit called Venture for America. How many of you have heard of Venture for America? So if you haven't heard of Venture for America, you might think it sounds a little bit like Teach for America, which was no accident. At the time, I was like, there should be a Teach for America for entrepreneurship. What do you call that, Venture for America? So this is the big left turn in my career. Before that, I was a fairly normal entrepreneur, I'd say. And my wife and I joke all the time that it was a bait and switch, because when I met her and we were dating and then eventually got married, I was a pretty normal entrepreneur. And so if she thought I was ever going to go political, she would have run the other direction screaming or been like, hey, nice to meet you. But I started this organization, Venture for America, because I thought, you know what, we have so many smart, enterprising young people, including out of places like USC, who do one of a handful of things in a handful of places. And what are those things and what are those places? Management consulting, investment banking, big tech, law, medicine, or academia in LA, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago. So we do one of 6 things in 6 places, and I thought that was a little bit messed up. How many of you are from California? Let's try that. Maybe half. So congratulations, you were born Californian. It's a great place. I was a pretend Californian during a lot of the campaign. California tech billionaire Andrew Yang, and my wife was like, "Where the heck is this $1 billion they're talking about?" And I was like, "Don't believe everything you read, baby." So my parents met at UC Berkeley as graduate students. My brother's named after the Lawrence Observatory, the Lawrence Science Center there. So I used to joke my parents must have gotten busy there, but they actually did. So I have this kind of Californian set of roots, but I was brought up in upstate New York, and when the press started branding me as California tech billionaire Andrew Yang, my team was like, "What are they doing? Like, that's not who you are." And I just was like, "Yeah, just go with it." Like that's what the media wants me to be. Like at that point, I was just looking for a foothold. But when I'd started this nonprofit, how many of you are active with a nonprofit of some kind? So you really should just pretend and raise your hand to that one, because that was like, "Are you a nice person?" And then they'll be like, "Well, no, I could tell if I'm lying or not." So I started this nonprofit, and nonprofits, it turns out, have very, very different mechanics than for-profit companies. So starting that nonprofit was a real journey. I'd say out of everything I've done in my career, and I've done some difficult things, starting and running that nonprofit was probably the hardest thing, before or since. When I was running for president, my wife was like, "Well, it's not as hard as starting that nonprofit." I was like, "Oh yeah, you're right." So started this nonprofit, marched around the country, trying to enlist and attract energy to startups in Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans, St. Louis, Baltimore, Birmingham, Alabama. Cities, by the way, I had not been to. It's like, so I'd show up in these cities and be like, "Hey, who are the startups? Hey, do you want like this incoming wave of talented graduates who want to help you build your businesses?" And then I went to college campuses saying, "Hey, do you want to come learn how to be an entrepreneur? And then if you did this fellowship, then we'd have a seed fund for you." You see, there was like this giant project. But during this time, I went to the Midwest and the South, and I had the sense that our economy was evolving in ways that were increasingly punitive and nasty and pushing a lot of people to the side. And then Trump won in 2016. You all remember that night? Yeah. I mean, gosh, you guys are, some of you were probably only 12 or 13 years old at that time. Which blows my mind, by the way. But so Trump wins, and you're like, "Is this normal?" And your parents are like, "No, this is this is not normal." So I was in the like, "Holy cow, this is a giant red flag to the country" camp. And so I started looking around, saying, "Well, what the heck can I do to help?" And I was convinced that our economy was evolving in these ways faster and faster, and those megatrends were leading to something like Trump becoming our president, where we eliminated 4 million manufacturing jobs. And where were those jobs that we got rid of? Rust Belt. It was Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. If that set of states sounds familiar, those are the states that Trump needed to win and did win. Some of them flipped back to Joe Biden in 2020, but I'd been to a lot of those communities. I saw the tide going out. How many of you are concerned about ChatGPT-4 and AI doing a number on jobs that you might have been interested in pursuing? You probably should be, by the way. It's really, really powerful. It's very, very good. So there was this giant automation wave that hit millions of manufacturing workers in the Midwest, leads to Trump in 2016. I had tons of friends in technology who would say to me over drinks, in private, not in public, but in private they'd be like, oh yeah, we're going to get rid of millions of jobs. And so I said, well, shoot, what the heck can I do to help wake the country up and try and mainstream a solution, universal basic income, that I thought we were going to wind up with at some point if we knew what was good for us. So I went to my wife and said, hey baby, thinking of running for president on a platform of giving everyone money. I'm going to be the magical Asian man from the future. It's going to be great. And my wife heard the plan and was like, hey, I think everyone's going to take this idea and run with it. And then I said, well, that would be tremendous, because if I can advance this idea and they can run with it, then, I'm running to try and accelerate the alleviation of mass poverty in the US. So that was the goal, become the anti-poverty candidate. And the campaign ended up becoming something very different than I thought it was going to be. How many of you are interested in running for political office at some point? Raise your hand. Oh, look at that. There's a courageous few. I love it. How many of you are in your high school's play? All right. If you were in your high school's play and you have fond memories about it, you should consider running for political office. Because it turns out those two pursuits actually have a lot of overlap. So I ran for president. Made 7 presidential debate stages, raised $40 million from Americans around the country. If some of you are in that, thank you. Though I guess many of you are pretty young, and it's not normal for a 15-year-old to donate to a presidential candidate. But despite everything we achieved, I came off the trail and I felt terrible about the direction of American politics. You know what I mean? I got universal basic income approval from 27% when I started to 65% when I finished. So on that level, I was pretty successful. But I still felt terrible. And so when I feel terrible about something, I try and figure out what I can do about it. It's the only way I can feel better about it. It's sort of a thing with me. If I'm not doing anything about it, it just continues to make me feel terrible. So I started digging into why I felt like our politics were descending into madness. And I figured out that it's by design. It's by poor design. And Cami made reference to this in the intro a little bit. But you rewind the clock to, let's call it the 50s. The two parties were like vanilla versus French vanilla. They were pretty similar. They were kind of different versions of each other, but it was no big deal. Fast forward to today, and we're more polarized than at any point we've been since the American Civil War. Almost half of Democrats regard Republicans as morally corrupt and a threat to the country. Shocker, about half of Republicans feel that way about Democrats. And if there's one thing that parents don't want for their kids now, it's to marry someone from the other party. I don't know if you've seen these studies. It's it used to be religion, now it's politics. Or it might have been race. Now race, they'll be like, sure, bring home someone as long as they're not from the other party. It's cool. So this party activation, by the way, it's new to America, but it's also highly unusual if you look at democracies around the world. We're at a very, very dangerous point that's unique. And the two parties started diverging over time, doesn't happen overnight. So the first big thing that happens is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Where the South before then, you might not believe this, but the South was solid Democrat back then. It was called the Solid South. So then they flip, become Republican. In the 80s, Reagan repealed something called the Fairness Doctrine. Who knows what the Fairness Doctrine is? What is the Fairness Doctrine, sir?
You have to have both sides represented.
Yes. If you ever see some old-timey news footage from the 70s, you'll see two people in chairs having a conversation. Why is it structured like that? Because there was a rule on the books that said if you're talking about a political issue, you have to present both sides. Huh? And then Reagan got rid of that. And then in 1992, Fox News gets started, MSNBC gets started, 2004, Facebook comes along, and then the two parties start diverging in terms of urban and rural areas, coastal and interior areas, educated and not educated, to the point where now more and more counties are what's called landslide counties, where they're going to be very clearly blue or very clearly red. Simultaneously, the country's gotten carved up like a turkey into blue zones and red zones. What is the approval rating for U.S. Congress as we're here together right now?
9.
I heard 9, 15, and 23, and those numbers are all more or less accurate. It's like 15 to 22% is the satisfaction rate for Congress. What is the re-election rate for incumbent members of Congress? 94%. Yeah. So imagine a business where 4 out of 5 customers were unhappy, but you changed absolutely nothing. If you're an NBA fan, 94% is a better win rate than the Kevin Durant era Golden State Warriors or the Jordan era Chicago Bulls if you're my generation. So you have this system where more and more people are upset and angry, and then the folks who are in power are essentially entrenched, and you can't get rid of them. Now, how is it that you have such an astronomical re-elect rate if people are so unhappy? 90% of the congressional districts around the country are drawn to be uncompetitive. They're either blue or red. So if you're an individual member of Congress, how can you lose your job?
Primaried out.
Getting primaried from within your own party. So imagine you're a member of Congress. If you want to keep your job, all you have to do is keep the 10 to 12% most extreme ideological people off your back, and then you win. In the Republican Party, that has led to something very, very dark and nasty, because the 10 to 12% most extreme Republicans have very, very dark ideas about the direction the country should go. And so you can have very reasonable people, and I was talking to I guess I'll call him Arnold. I was talking to Arnold and his people before this talk and referred to them as, like what was the sane wing of the Republican Party. So if you were a very reasonable Republican, you get into this system and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, if I'm going to keep my job, I have to play ball with the folks over here. You know who did not play ball with the folks over here? The 10 Republican House members who voted to impeach Donald Trump. Remember that? They said, hey, this guy's gone too far. I think this is impeachment worthy. What happened to those 10 members of Congress? 8 of them are gone. And by the way, that 10, and this is a very good emblem of where we are. So those 10 members of Congress who voted to impeach Donald Trump, there were originally 25 or 30 of them. But what happened was they all got death threats and angry messages on their phone in the minutes leading up to the vote, so that when it was time to take the vote, some of them voted no. And then their friend next to them was like, wait a minute, you were supposed to vote yes. You were with me at the meeting where we said we're voting yes on this thing. And so what does that person do? They also vote no. So they started dropping like flies in real time during this vote. So imagine the courage and integrity it would take to still stick your hand up and vote yes. And everyone saw that, and 80% of them were out of Congress. I was on Bill Maher on Friday, and I remarked on one of them named Peter Meyer, who is from Michigan. So Peter, to me, did something very, very courageous. By the way, death threats immediately, had to go into hiding. I mean, that's what these folks did. And then he ended up getting booted out of office pretty quick because he lost in the Republican primary to an extremist. But in this case, that extremist was boosted by the Democrats by like a 7-figure investment, because the Democrats thought, you know what, Peter Meyer is a more formidable opponent than his crazy opponent in the primary, so let's boost the crazy person. That's what passes for smart politics in this two-party system, but everyone saw that if you went against the extreme of your party, you lose. There is a Democratic equivalent of this. It's not as dark. There's a lot of asymmetry, but trust me when I say that there are vested interests in the Democratic Party that no one wants to mess with. And if you mess with them, then things go badly for you. So this is why we feel so badly about our politics. The darkest thing about the system is that if you put a good, reasonable person in, they will not be able to actually go against the grain and keep their job. They will lose their job, and they can all see that. They all know that. They're all captive. So that is what I figured out over 2020, figuring out, like, what can we do about this? So what can you do about this in real life? What is the fix? Is there a fix? Yes.
abolishing gerrymandering?
If you could get rid of gerrymandering, that would go a long way. This entire non-competitive district, 90%. By the way, if you look at the shapes of these districts, they're insane. There was one graphic that showed that there's a district shaped like every letter of the alphabet. Because they're just reaching for voters, you know what I mean? They'll be like, "What? They're over there? Let's draw the district in a weird way." And then in New York, they drew the districts like blocks, and then it changed everything. It was a judge that overturned excessive gerrymandering on the part of the Dems in that case. So, constitutional amendment to get rid of gerrymandering, that's a great solution. What's the problem? What does it take to get a constitutional amendment?
States.
I think it's 3/4 of the states. Yeah. So what can you get across the finish line that 3/4 of the states are down with? So I was asking myself this very question, trying to figure out how do we fix American democracy, and I'm happy to say I found a solution, a real life solution that can cure us of everything I just described. I know it's magic, right? How many of you were keeping up with the elections this past midterm, particularly in Alaska, like Sarah Palin losing? Let's try that. So Sarah Palin loses to an anonymous legislator named Mary Peltola. And Sarah Palin lost to Mary Peltola in large part because there was no primary in Alaska. Anyone can vote for anyone. And so all of a sudden, instead of just having to answer to the 10 to 12% on either extreme, you have to try and get 51% of the greater whole, which, by the way, is what everyone imagines is happening now, but is not happening. You know what I mean? Like the illusion is you have to get 51% of us. The reality is you have to get these 10% over there. So in 2020, Alaska got rid of its party primaries. And then lo and behold, 2 years later, Sarah Palin loses, and we're all better off for it. Because imagine if Sarah Palin were a member of Congress, and then they'd be like, "Oh, good, another crazy person we can stick the microphone in front of. Lauren Boebert's not available. Hey, Sarah, what's your comment? Marjorie Taylor Greene, like the three of you together, and like." But by the way, one of the reasons why we know these names is because the press will cover folks who are batshit much more than they'll cover like the sane person. It's like the more inflammatory you are, the more press you get, the more energy you get. So Sarah Palin loses to this anonymous state legislator because they got rid of party primaries. Simultaneously, Lisa Murkowski, who voted to impeach Donald Trump, only Republican senator who was actually up for re-election, think about that, manages to get through and defeats a Trump-endorsed opponent named Kelly Tshibaka, who was also not great at all. And so if there's a Republican primary, Lisa Murkowski loses to Kelly Tshibaka hands down. She loses just like all the other House members. But they got rid of the primary. So what did it take to get rid of that primary? It took $6 million. Alaska is a very cheap media state. If you wanted to have your face on Alaskan TV tomorrow, it can be arranged. Just give me $500 and we'll get that commercial up. So $6 million to make this case in Alaska. And I saw, oh my gosh, if you just did what they did in Alaska all over the country, you'd have a chance. And it turns out that 25 states have the same ballot initiative measure where if you get 50.1% of the people in that state to vote to get rid of the party primaries, they can do it. What do you all think of that as an answer? That's the answer. Just get rid of the party primaries, and then we all have a chance again because the incentives will coalesce around the majority in the middle and the reasonable as opposed to the extremes. By the way, the extremes have started to figure this out, and they're freaking out. They're like, wait a minute, you mean I can't boss everyone around? I can't scare everyone? I can't cudgel them? It's like, so we went from Alaska. By the way, Maine already has a system. Maine and Alaska. Problems with Maine and Alaska is people think they're weird. they're kind of far away. They're off in the corners. So the same measure was on the ballot in Nevada in November. Now, Nevada is kind of normal-ish. And here was the advertisement to the people of Nevada. It was a military veteran speaking to camera saying, I went overseas to defend our country. I'm an independent. I can't vote in our primaries. And I don't think that's right. Now, Nevadans saw that ad and were like, wow, that guy really should be able to vote. That's pretty messed up. So then the Democratic Party came out against allowing that guy to vote, independents to vote the primaries, and the Republicans came out against it. And then what did the Nevadan voters say? The Nevadans said, you know what, that guy should be able to vote. That ballot initiative won 53% to 47%, even though both parties were against it. And the Democratic Party, I was in Nevada campaigning for this measure, and the Democratic Party was sending out text messages saying, vote no on question 3. And what was their rationale behind why Democrats should vote no on question 3? It'll be too confusing. Be too confusing for voters. So people looked at that message and were like, wait, too confusing? I don't know if I buy that. So enough Nevadans raised their hands to say, let's make this change. But getting those TV ads on air, Nevada is not as cheap as Alaska, it costs $17 million. So we're going to try and take a shot at another 4 or 5 states in 2024 at a cost of, let's call it $100 million. How does $100 million sound to you all as an investment in the rationalization of our democracy? Pretty good, right? For context, we spend about $20 billion every 4 years hating each other. So if that's the investment in a dysfunctional system, how much is it worth to us to actually make it rational? So that is my mission. Now you'll hear a lot of, if you actually look up Andrew Yang, Forward Party, the rest of it, you hear a lot of stuff that's false, honestly. What we are is we're a popular, positive movement of Americans who want to cure our political system of its deranged incentives. The problem is you cannot do that from within the two-party system. You can't. If you say, hey, I'm going to do this as a Democrat, the Democrats, by the way, neither party wants to adopt this. Why? Why do they not want to adopt getting rid of the primaries? Gives more power to the party, allows them to control more, but most of all, it's predictable and containable. They know who's going to vote. They know how to win. The consultants have that stuff already drawn out to the T, to the number, right? So each political figure goes to their consultant and says, hey, how do we feel about this? And the consultant says, we hate it, because if you adopt this, we don't know what it's going to take to win. And so they say, hey, I don't like this. So you can't do it from within the two-party system. The only way to do it is to do it from outside of the two-party system. So I got to that point, and then I said I have 2 choices: start a nonprofit or start a political movement. What was the problem with starting a nonprofit? No one would fucking care. Know what I mean? Because that's the role nonprofits play in American life today. It's like hey, I like it, but you're never going to actually do it, so I don't need to worry about it. But if you actually make it a political movement, then people are like, wait a minute, like that might do the trick, particularly in an era when 62% of Americans know the two-party system is not serving our interests, it's not representative, and people want some alternative, including 74% of Democrats, by the way, want there to be some kind of political alternative. So that is the new mission in life, and I'm proud to stand before you, the co-chair of the 3rd biggest political party in the country. My resources a year and a half in. What do y'all think? I will be the first to admit there's a very steep drop-off between 2 and 3. But hey, we'll take it, and we're growing every single day. So I started out as an entrepreneur who wanted to solve problems, and it turns out as I've gotten going, I see the problems are getting bigger and nastier, whether it's climate change, polarization, immigration, poverty. Like the problems are getting worse, and our government right now does not need to solve any of our problems because our problems and they're getting reelected are essentially completely disconnected at this point. It was a US Senator who said this to me, and this is the thought I'm going to close on. An issue is now worth more to us unaddressed than addressed. And why did she say that? Because if they don't solve the problem, she said, these are her words, I can raise money on it, I can get votes on it, I can get energy around it. If I lean forward to solve the problem, what happens to that senator? The base attacks them, they compromised with the enemy, they're ideologically impure, their job security goes down. What we have to do as a people is make it so that that senator and everyone like her can actually do the right thing by us and keep their jobs. And that's the vision of the Forward Party. We hope you'll join us in making that a reality. Thank you all so much.
Do you want to sit?
Sure.
All right, so I'm going to ask the first question, and then we want students to ask questions. So if you have a question, if you could come up to the corners here and stand, I think that might be easiest. So if you have a question, this is your chance. Come right up here, and get ready. All right, so thanks for that. My first question is about the Forward Party and the 3rd largest party in the United States, as you mentioned. Yeah, I'm a political scientist. As a political scientist, I always think about Duverger's law, which is the idea that in single-member districts, 2 parties are primarily going to compete. is your strategy in the party to go national for president, or is it to go in a place like LA where it's mostly Democratic only and to emerge as the second main party, or to go into rural Nebraska where it's all Republicans and try to emerge as the second party?
Christian, that's such a smart, savvy question. So a lot of the mistaken thinking around Forward is it just races straight to the presidential. The argument is like Ralph Nader, Ross Perot, Jill Steiner, whoever your third-party presidential candidate is. But when you dig into the mechanics around the country, there are 500,000 plus locally elected officials, and 70% of those races are uncontested or uncompetitive. 37 out of the 50 states have one-party rule, including California, where there's really no meaningful competition. So one of the major principles is that we think there should be more competition for school board, for county executive, for city council, for mayor, and it shouldn't just be one party's insiders passing the baton to the next person in line who's earned it by being in the party. And often, by the way, by having the financial resources to be able to help the party out over a particular period of time. So we want to introduce competition at the local level, and right here in California, we're partnering with a group called the Common Sense Party of California to create a legitimate alternative on the ballot. Because even if you want, let's just say, like, remove the party labels for a second, let's just say you want like good things to happen for people and families and communities. The question is, how do you make it so that the folks in charge have to deliver good things for people and families and communities in order to keep their job? And to create that, you need some form of viable competition. So to your point about Duverger's law and the rest of it, if you have this nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting and the same people win, but their incentives are better, that's an enormous win. Like Lisa Murkowski, who was in the Senate, said in private, but whatever, I'll share it, doesn't matter. She said that half a dozen of her colleagues have come up to her and said, "We envy you so much you don't have a party primary anymore." You know what I mean? Like, they get it. Like they see. So even if it's the same humans, if their interests are the same as ours, then that's a massive improvement, regardless of what the letter is next to their name.
First question over here, and if you all who are asking questions could just state your name and then ask the question.
Hi, Mr. Yang, Sasha. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. So my question is, you talk a lot about unity. So 2 years ago, you tweeted some pro-Israeli sentiments, and it upset a lot of Muslim populations and pro-Palestinian populations in your home city of New York City. How do you address polarization on issues that are really divisive, and how do you create unity?
It's a great question, and on that topic, and it's tragic what's happening in that part of the world. I have friends on both sides, genuinely, and I think most people want there to be a middle ground solution that involves, in that case, two states that can emerge and live peacefully. But to your greater point, it's one of the examples of issues that people can feel very, very strongly about on each side. And the goal should be to see the folks who are on the other side of it as human beings. Or if you're talking about, in the American political context, as your fellow citizens and Americans who can feel very passionately about an issue on the other side, but that doesn't make them any less worthwhile or any less important or any less moral, as a human being themselves.
Next question.
Hey, Andrew, it's Adam. Great to meet you today. I was wondering if you could speak more to how you envision the UBI to be distributed to everyone. Right now, I think like the percentage of people that actually that collect their unemployment benefits who are eligible for them is quite low, like somewhere in the 20s, and so it's a challenge. Everyone who is eligible gets what they.
there was a period when COVID happened where all these major publications were reaching out to me about, hey, like now we're about to do what you we're campaigning on. What do you think about it? And checks went out to tens of millions of Americans. There were problems with the way it was administered. Now, if you fast forward to today, there's a lot of blaming the stimulus checks for inflation and saying, okay, like, well, UBI would cause rampant inflation. So the government put $5 trillion into the economy in terms of COVID relief. If you do the quick math on that, if there are 330 million Americans, that's about $15,000 per American. How much did individuals actually get in that time? It was a very, very small fraction. It's about 17% of the 15,000. So the other 83% went into companies and everything else. At the same time, they had the enhanced child tax credit that reduced child poverty by 2.1 million or so. And when I talked to a Fed chair, he said if everyone had a Federal Reserve account, we could just put money in, that would solve the problem. Right now they're using the IRS, which is really, really imperfectly designed for this, because if you're below a certain income threshold, they don't have your mailing address, you don't pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the most vulnerable people actually never got money. When COVID happened, my organization sent out $5 million directly to needy Americans in increments of $500 or so, and I'll be honest with you, we didn't really verify a whole lot. Like, just someone came and said, hey, I'm this person, this is my situation, and then we just sent them $500. And then someone would ask me, it's like, well, then how do you measure it? How do you know you're not being defrauded? And I was like, I'm pretty confident that, you know, the person who got the $500, like, I mean, we did sometimes do spot checks on them. Right now, we have this paternalistic system that keeps people in poverty very, very often. So I'd love for there to be a mechanism of distributing economic relief that was not dependent on the IRS, because the IRS misses everyone who's below a certain income threshold.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Right over here.
Hi, I'm Brenda. Thank you so much for coming. My question is, what are your thoughts on implementing ranked choice voting into primaries instead of getting rid of them altogether?
So I ran in a ranked choice voting primary, and I think that's a dramatic improvement because you can then ask people for their second choice votes. I think it's a lot less powerful than if it's field-wide and nonpartisan, and here's why. So 900,000 people voted in the mayoral primary I was a part of. That might sound like a lot. It was actually up 10% from the last cycle. How many people live in New York City? Any New Yorkers here? It's all right. I was told there'd be no math. It's like 9.1 million or so. So you had 10% of people vote in the Democratic primary, and then the winner might get 3 or 4%. So if you have ranked choice voting in that primary, it's better, but you're still really taking a very, very narrow sliver of citizens and saying who they elect is going to end up winning. Because after you get that Democratic nomination, then there's no general. It's like a lot of like these congressional seats we're talking about. So I'm for ranked choice voting in any context, in a primary, local, but I think that its true potential only gets reached when you can do it across parties. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, for coming today. My name's Kevin. One question that I want to ask about political polarization is, I feel like I experienced it a lot, not just at like kind of the national electoral level, but more like, the private discussions I have with folks and, how those discussions also get really polarized. And one accusation that I feel myself facing when I kind of advocate for a little bit more of a less politically polarized American public that's open to considering, bipartisan solutions is I'm like both sidesing it, like, how dare I ever consider the other side, having the best, ethical issues? We should actually just debate it out, and you don't try to find the middle ground solution because one side is clearly right on this issue. So I just wanted to know from your perspective as a politician on how you defuse these conversations and make sure they're productive, and any tips you have for young college students when they kind of navigate these political discussions.
Is there a Bridge USA chapter here at USC? Yes. Yes? Oh, look at that. Anyway, it's just an org where they bring people together to have conversations about different things. The both sidesism thing is interesting because there are issues that people feel very strongly about and say, look, if you're on the other side of this, then, then we disagree about something very, very important. The thing I've found is that, how many of you have heard of a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind? So I read this book that changed my thinking about a lot of things. But what he said was that he went around the world to try and find different societies and what their moral structures were. And it turns out that there were essentially 6 universal human values that every society thinks comprise morality. Are you guys ready for the 6? All right. So kindness, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. And that in every culture, you can put their morality structure and say it falls along one of these six values. So it turns out different people respond to different values differently, which makes sense. That unfortunately in American life today, these values have become politicized because that's the way America works now. And so the left responds more to kindness and fairness. The right responds more to loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And then you have liberty. It's interpreted differently on both sides and used differently. So with this as a framework, it turns out that there are people, Kevin, that think the same way you do, and it's like a percentage of humans based upon their culture, their background, their brain wiring, et cetera, et cetera. The big discovery I had when I was running for president was that I talk the way I talk, and it turns out everything I was saying ended up being this different symbolic political language. And anyone who was in politics would say, Yang, you're doing this all wrong. You have to say these things over here because then the folks in the Democratic Party and the base will like you more. And the things you're saying right now, I've never heard anything like it, so it's wrong. Now, I couldn't listen to these consultants because it turns out you are who you are, and then you talk the way you talk. I guess I could have pretended, but I was running for years, and I was like, I can't pretend to be someone else for for years. And I'm a bad actor anyway. My wife tells me that. So Kevin, there's a certain group of people that will naturally respond to your approach and your moral language. And the big lesson I've gotten from this is that you should actually be totally okay with reaching your people and not everybody. And if there's someone that attacks you for this, sometimes it hurts. It's painful. Everyone thinks of themselves a good person and no one wants to be categorized as bad or immoral. But you just have to have the fortitude to say, look, I'm sorry if this isn't for you, but, this is the road approach for me. And I'm just going to keep on trying to find the people that think the same way I do or feel the same way I do. You just can't expect to appeal to everyone because, we all have different chords that activate us.
Thank you.
Now we have a question from Raquel.
Hi, my name's Raquel. So you talked a little bit about ranked choice voting so far, but I know you also kind of looked at other types of voting methods. There's more voting methods out there.
Such a democracy nerd, Raquel. No, I'm kidding.
Do you like ranked choice the best out of different voting methods, or are you into other ones?
Oh my gosh. Am I a voting system philanderer?
Do you have a particular position?
Do you have specific other ones in mind?
Oh, I'm familiar with approval voting, for example.
Yeah, you would say approval. No, the reason I'm joking is because Raquel's, I believe, a PhD in this, right? We're getting a PhD? Yeah. So she's what I call a democracy nerd. I love democracy nerds. I've become kind of an amateur democracy nerd myself. So when I was trying to figure out these voting systems, it turns out that every voting system has its pluses and minuses. The current plurality first past the post voting system we use is just about the worst in everyone's estimation. Everyone's like, look, this is a disaster. Spoiler effect, strategic voting, it's all baked into the current system. So approval voting, star voting, ranked choice voting are all more modern, effective voting systems that get rid of a lot of the negative effects. And when I was researching these systems, turns out I loved them all. And I will say that, there are very real arguments for approval voting in particular that I found very compelling. But ranked choice voting had the most momentum and traction around the nation. It was getting more and more pickup. And I thought, you know what? It's hard enough getting America to understand the problem, a solution, without introducing multiple versions of the solution. So I'm going to pick one of these voting systems and just charge into it. And ranked choice voting was one that I had direct experience with as a candidate. It had the most momentum around the country. So I said, okay, I'm going to become Mr. Ranked Choice Voting and run around and saying ranked choice voting is the answer, which it genuinely is. At the same time, when people are for approval voting, I'm like, let's go. Very happy to see that happen. Star voting, same thing. If you don't know about these voting systems, just know that they're much, much better than the current first past the post voting system. That's almost purposefully bad. Like they use it as a way to crowd out competition and not to express popular will.
Thank you.
No problem, Raquel. But yeah, I love the other voting systems too. I am a voting system philanderer that way.
Hi, Mr. Yang. My name's Soham. Thank you for coming today. One thing I really appreciated about your proposal and what you're doing with your work is that it's very rational in terms of trying to make sure that politicians are, accountable to a larger group of people than they are in the primary system. But I think one thing that you talked about that system doesn't address as much is trying to improve the integrity and courage of politicians. They're still thinking about how to be accountable to a certain group of people instead of focusing on doing what they think is right. Do you think that there's anything we can do as a country or should be happening to focus on improving the courage, integrity, or just quality of person who is running for office in the U.S., or is that more of a loss?
Wow, what an interesting question. Raise your hand again if you were considering running for political office. Let's try that. So I think that the number of hands might go up more if people thought that the system was a little bit more functional and rational. You know what I mean? Like that. I think these two things reinforce each other. I know a lot of folks who have it or would consider running for office, but now are like, no, thank you. I don't want 50% of Americans to hate me. I don't want like this and that. I don't want to get trashed by this. I had crazy nights in my 20s. I don't feel like are fit for public consumption. So there are a lot of things about this political environment that scare off very good people. That's one reason why I'm so focused on the incentives, is that instead of having the hero narrative where it's like, oh, if we only just got that one moral person into this office, then all would be well. I don't think that's the challenge. I think that if you sent a moral person in, you would just get very disappointed X years later. And we have to try and address the root cause of our disappointment.
Okay, we have time for probably about 2, maybe 3 more questions.
Though the hero narrative is very attractive, though. I mean, you guys might, I voted for Obama twice. Was like, an ambassador and the rest of it. You guys are, you guys are so young that, how old were you when Obama first won? Anyway, doing some math in my head.
8.
I was an adult and I was freaking pumped when Obama won. Anyway.
I'm Mr. Yang. Great speech. Thank you for coming today. My name is Orion, and I'm actually also from upstate New York, so I feel you. My question, you have discussed a lot today about mitigating the consequences of extremism on a national level. I would like to know how you would look at it at an interpersonal level. For example, 2 years ago, you wrote an op-ed for Washington Post and received very bit of criticism on how to address, as an Asian American, the rise in hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of people said that, what you were saying was, essentially show that you're more American. A lot of people were criticizing that for adhering to the model minority myth. I would like to know, how would you connect that kind of approach to these really personal issues that affect entire demographics and affect the psyche of an entire nation? Because because it was quite, like I said, quite criticized, and how you would connect that to your political aspirations with your new party.
Is it Ryan or Orion?
Orion.
Orion. Thanks for the question. The message in that piece was that we, and when I say we, I mean everyone really, but I was talking in that article to a subgroup of Americans that I happen to belong to, Asian Americans, is that that we all have to try and do more in terms of volunteering, voting, being active in our community, anything that is a little bit bigger and and focused on the really country as a whole was the argument I was making. And when I talk to Asian Americans in particular, I'm very, my own experience was my parents came to this country as immigrants, and they came for better opportunities for me and my brother, and it pretty much worked. Now the shoe's on the other foot, where this country is falling apart, and this country kind of needs folks to step up for it in any way under the sun. I wanted to send that message to Asian Americans because, again, that's just the community I'm a part of. Would never claim to speak for all Asian Americans because it's an extraordinarily diverse community. But that was the message, and I also have said to Asian American groups, look, if this country does disintegrate, we're going to be among the groups that gets thrown under the bus, and I thought that might happen because of a rising Cold War, worse with China, but it turns out it was COVID, and that was terrible. So it's been a really rough time for a lot of folks, including people I know and my family members, but the choice really is to do less or to do more. And I've just taken the message being like, okay, we have to do more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Orion. I appreciate it.
Right over here.
Hi, Mr. Yang. I'm Nick. As you know, the cost of healthcare in America is too high. And it seems like such a complex problem. I mean, you have these pharmaceutical companies with incredible leverage over the government. You have the insurance companies, which are massive and in a completely stagnant playing field. In a world where keeping the status quo will harm millions of Americans, and in a world where dismantling the system is politically unfeasible, is there any way you would simplify the problem of healthcare in America, and where should we begin in a feasible way?
Well, it's so specific. I love it. You would not believe how many heartbreaking stories I heard when I was running for president from families who couldn't afford health care for themselves, their children, their parents. It's one of the main things that's breaking families around the country. And I think it is, to your point, one of the clearest emblems of what our political dysfunction has cost us, where you have the healthcare system jacking up costs over and over again with no end in sight. It's now, I think, 17 or 18% of the economy. It gets worse results than any comparable system. And it's run amok because our political class can't do anything about it. So there are only very few ways out. By the way, this is a California story too. So Governor Newsom ran on universal health care when he ran for governor. I don't know how many of you know this story. So he ran on universal health care. And then what happened when well, by the way, Democrats have a supermajority in California. They have, I think, 3/4 of the legislature. So do you all like the universal health care here in the state? I mean, I joke, but what happened to that? It never even went to a vote. The lobbyists called the legislators and be like, do not vote on this. And then no one ever voted on it. And then when someone asked the governor, it's like, hey, didn't you run on this? He said something like, yeah, it's easier to run on something than pass it, or something. He said something like that, which might be a factual statement. I mean, that's not untrue, but it's not exactly what you want to hear. But this is an example of a society-wide problem that can only be solved, in my opinion, at the federal level. And the only way out would be to have some kind of public option of healthcare that then creates some competitive dynamic for the private insurers the private insurers' business model right now is just how much are we going to raise prices by this year? And then that percentage is typically 8, 9, 10%. And so if you had a public option that was trying to create some viable competition, then maybe at a minimum they can't turn the dial over and over again. That to me is the only way out.
Okay, thanks. We've had a lot of really great questions, and I appreciate the open debate and the discussion that we've heard. Whether we agree or disagree on everything, it was really fun, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, USC. The sky's the limit for you all.
Before we go.